Hello and welcome to the Avengers Assemble podcast, where we are reading all of the Avengers. And tonight, I'm joined by a special guest. Oh, I'm Van Allen Plexico, your host, of course, and we are joined by a special guest, Dr. Gordon Schmidt. Dr. Gordon Schmidt is professor of management at the University of Louisiana Monroe, and he is the author of Leaders Assemble, Leadership in the MCU. And first up, how are you doing tonight, Gordon?
Doing great. Very excited to be talking to you here and about this book that my co-author Naisai Islam wrote. You know, we've loved comics our whole life, and so it's exciting to get to combine kind of our two worlds of this research and, Avengers and Marvel superheroes.
Yeah. So I can see where you would write, and it sounds like a really, really cool thing, and we're going to go through it, and we're going to talk about it. But before we get into it, I was just going to ask you, so I was saying before, I can see where a professor of management would be interested in writing a book about leadership. Absolutely. But how did Marvel and the MCU get involved in it?
Yeah, that's great. And so, kind of the secret origin story.
Yes.
For both Sai and I, we know we both grew up with the comics, right? We're both big Spider-Man fans. I grew up with the Avengers a lot. And so, I've read comics my whole life, was so excited when the MCU started. But I never really thought about it as something, we could use to talk about sort of our field of industrial organizational psychology. We used examples in class. I actually, when the Avengers was out on video, we did a showing on campus and talked about leadership in the Avengers, right? And so we've done little things here and there. But basically, there was a call that went out for a book series about exploring popular culture, exploring leadership through popular culture that was coming out. And so they've done some great books. Mike Urich, who runs the series, he wrote a book on Star Wars and leadership. And then he wrote a book on Middle Earth and leadership. And so they were asking for proposals. And I was like, hey, Sai, don't you think Marvel would be really good for this? The Marvel Cinematic Universe. We love these things, and there's so much leadership stuff going on, so many interesting aspects. Because both Sai and I do quite a bit of stuff on trying to outreach to the community, teach people about leadership and psychology and all this research that's been done, when a lot of it just never gets out to the public. It never affects real life behavior, right? And so we're always looking for engaging examples. And I was like, hey, why don't we do this book? Teach leadership through these movies that everybody is interested in, make it very easy and accessible for everybody to act on this stuff. And so that's what we do in the book is we talk about the movies, we talk about leadership concepts, and we have people kind of think about their own experiences of leadership as well, so that you could apply that and you could learn from Captain America, you'd learn from Iron Man, both in terms of good things to do as well as what they screwed up. And, they screwed up a lot of stuff in the movies, right? There's a lot of stuff to learn in both directions from all kinds of leaders across these MCU movies, right?
Well, I think we know some of the things you could learn from Tony Stark, many of which couldn't be printed in a book like that. But my first thing I was going to ask you is how is every chapter not about Captain America?
Well, and that's the thing about leadership, though. There's a lot of different ways we can lead. There's a lot of different leadership situations. So one thing about us, too, is we come from the idea of leadership as a process. So leadership is about influencing other people, changing their behaviors and attitudes in some way, right? And so, yeah, Captain America, very natural leader, someone we look to. But even somebody like, Star-Lord, he's got to influence this disparate group of Guardians. And he can't be just telling them, this is what you do and they'll do it, right? And so that's what we see in a team like the Guardians of the Galaxy is everybody kind of leads at points based on their expertise, based on, their experiences. And so that's kind of what we do is we look at all these different types of leadership in the book because, yeah, it's not every day you're going to be able to be the boss that everybody listens to. And frankly, there's not a lot of bosses that everybody listens to just because they said so, right? And so we really try to think about those aspects because sometimes we can act like the big boss, the CEO tells us what to do. We act like robots and do the exact thing. And that's how the life works. I've never seen that work that easily. No. I've been a leader and it hasn't worked that easily. There's a lot more to that process. And it's not just command and control like we often see. So I think the Avengers are great for that, right? Because they're all people that can save the world on their own. They're all very skilled in what they do. even Hawkeye, Black Widow. These people are skilled, and you get them together and you say, hey, to fight Thanos, to fight this great threat, you got to work together. These very individualistic, very different people. And it's hard. There's a lot of conflict, and you can't just say Captain America or Tony Stark do this. That ain't going to work. You got to convince them. You got to get them on the same page. And sometimes it don't work, as we see in the movies. Sometimes there's big conflicts and problems.
Sometimes you have a Hulk on your team that you really have to be creative to figure out how to control or motivate, right? I mean, everybody's different, and everybody has a different, I guess, a different lever that moves them, right? So a leader is somebody that can figure out which levers to pull that'll work and which ones would not, or would actually be detrimental, right? I mean, that's
and being influenced yourself. A good leader is going to be influenced by those people that are their followers, because they're going to have greater expertise. And I think Guardians of the Galaxy, of course, is a great example of that, because you have Star-Lord might be the leader if you wrote it on paper, but if you're trying to break out of the prison, Rocket's an expert on that. If you're talking about Thanos, Gamora's got more knowledge in that direction. Even Groot inspires the group at times in the movies, right? And so it's not just there's the boss, you listen. It's all of these different people. I'm the expert here. I know what's going on. We don't see it a lot in the movies, but somebody like Black Widow, an expert in espionage, that would come up that comes up in the comics in various ways, where you might want somebody like that to help figure out what the team should do. Thor shouldn't be the espionage expert or lead the team when you're trying to break in somewhere, but Black Widow really should. The movies are often so big that, people like Hawkeye and Black Widow get minimalized because they don't have the biggest power set. But in day-to-day Avenger comics, sometimes those people shine a lot based on what's going on.
Sure. Well, it's kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons group where there's times that the big warrior, the barbarian, or the magic user is important, but there's times you need the thief, the little rogue, the little hobbit or something to do something,
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Yeah, you need a tool for every occasion, and every occasion is not a full-scale war. There are times for other, Iron Man has, in the comics, Iron Man has stealth armor, because not every conflict is a frontal assault,
Yeah.
So, let's tell about the process. Before we get into the chapter by chapter kind of discussion and so forth a little bit, how did the process go of putting it together? I've written a number of books with co-authors, and some of them fiction, some of them nonfiction, and it's always a different process. So how did you and your co-author manage this?
Yeah, and so I think one good thing with Cy and I have written articles together and other stuff. So we've got a little bit of a flow already, but a whole book, of course, is a bigger thing. And so one of the things that we did kind of together was come up with sort of the big model of what the book's going to be. We came up with generally chapters that we were going to do. And then we worked on sort of an opening chapter to kind of set this tone, set the stage. And then we sort of had chapters we focused on. One of us wrote it. We shared notes back and forth, or articles and stuff to kind of guide them. But that was so we have a bit of a division, sort of chapter by chapter on it. Unlike sort of a novel, we're not having a continuing story from chapter to chapter that can cause its own issues of, as we see in the comics, you get a fill-in person and suddenly people aren't acting appropriately, or you forgot that this person's on the moon. or
right,
or whatever, those types of things where you're just like, I don't know. And so that was helpful too. And so we kind of focused on particular movies that we watched again, and we sort of wrote that so we individually kind of wrote those chapters while looking to make sure they were connected together okay. So it went pretty well. It went better than expected, honestly, because it can go in all kinds of directions when you're working with somebody.
Yeah. So, was one of you more responsible for coming up with the examples that you used, or did you kind of compare notes and think, oh, well, what about we use this? Well, how about this?
Yeah, and so what we did is we had a Google Doc with sort of examples and chapters. So I know what I would do is when I would watch a movie, and then I would be like, oh, chapter 8, this is related to chapter 8, or this is related to chapter whatever.
Okay.
And so both of us kind of did some of those, and then depending on who wrote the chapter, they would grab the examples that made sense to them there. And the chapters, are pretty focused on a movie or two, and so therefore it was easy to be like, okay, if you're watching Black Panther, these two chapters are really the most focused on that film, and so that's what you're looking for a little bit. And so yeah, we kind of were developing and outlining and kind of doing it until somebody could take it off and sort of write that chapter, put it together.
All right, so I got to ask you this real quick. I always like the process questions, and I have a few more of those.
Like process,
but I don't want to bore everybody to death with that kind of stuff because it's interesting to me and you, but it may not be to everybody. I gotta step over outside for just a second and ask you: was there one of the MCU movies that you thought just had great examples of leadership more than any other movie, and were there any that you're like, I can't really use this movie at all? This movie just is totally useless for my purposes.
So there's some of the movies I think are really good for those aspects. Civil War I think was a great movie for looking at when sort of leadership breaks down, and Civil War. It's Civil War really is a tragedy, right? Because you've got Tony Stark, who for the best intentions kind of wants the UN to take over, as well as his own kind of PTSD. He feels like the heroes are part of the problem. We need somebody to take over. I completely understand that perspective. And we got Cap on the other side with this, we got to have our own morals decide what happened. We can't do this out. And after his own problems, with the government and evil conspiracies, it makes perfect sense. So again, we got two guys, which the comic version of Civil War does this some, but there definitely is a lot of ambiguity of, is one of these paths better in that film? But I think to me, the tragedy is there's probably room for compromise between those two perspectives, right? Is that it doesn't have to be you give all authority to the UN and the team has none, or the team has all authority and the UN has none. We could have, maybe you could have the UN sets general missions and people can decide which ones fit with their morals, or maybe there's some level of the composition of the team could be affected by, in the comics, right? You have Peter Gyrich or whatever being like, you can only have 7 members, and they have to was it kicking off Hawkeye? I can't remember who was kicked off. Hawkeye sounds like the type that got kicked off.
Added the Falcon when he'd never even been a member before, and Hawkeye was losing his mind. Yeah, that was that was like 171 or something. That's correct.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite eras. So it's been a while since I read it actually, but yeah, it sticks in the mind. And so there's a lot of different ways you could have talked about that. And so we talk about compromise and collaboration. Compromise, we're kind of meeting in the middle. We're not both happy. Collaboration, we're trying to really figure out our interests and our needs and come up with a solution that's better than just splitting in the middle, right? And so there's a potential for that in Civil War that gets lost because it's either Tony or it's Cap, and really they don't try to get other people's opinions. It's just you're on one side or the other. And right. Honestly, the whole next arc, right, is partly affected by the fact that Avengers are trying to, arrest each other. They're not working together. I don't know if that affects some of the Thanos stuff, but the team kind of hating each other definitely didn't help the situation, right?
No. Oh no. Well, that's the beauty of a drama like that, is when you bring in the biggest villain and you're playing for the highest stakes, you want to have your heroes at their lowest point. So not only do they have to face this impossible challenge, they have to do it coming from the deepest hole. It really was brilliant how once they decided I think once Kevin Feige and the others decided where phase 3 was going, and that it was going to end with this giant Infinity War thing in Endgame, I think they were brilliant about taking all these seeds that they'd thrown out and gathering them, these threads, right, and gathering them together. I don't think anybody believes they had it planned from the beginning. They threw a whole lot out, and then they just followed what was working. But okay, so Civil War was particularly useful, and I can definitely see where that would be the case.
Yeah, Black Panther as well. We got a lot of great stuff from that as well.
I bet.
Thinking about leadership transitions and power. How do you have power or not? There's so many power dynamics in that film. They're a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And then on the other hand, was there any one of the movies that you just went, this is useless? I can't there's no point. No point watching it.
I felt that way about Doctor Strange quite a bit because I
Yeah.
kind of feel like I feel like in the MCU, Doctor Strange is like a poor man's Iron Man. There's not character growth. He seems kind of like a jerk. The romance is not meaningful. Like
Yeah.
the multiverse movie too, Madness and Multiverse. Like it's like, oh, we're in love in every reality, and I was like, you're not in love in this reality, man. Like you guys don't have any chemistry. You don't care about each other really. Like the plot needs it, right? But like I never, yeah, and so like, well, Iron Man has this sort of arc and this sort of trying to get better. I never really felt that for Doctor Strange. I think there's some good visuals in that first Strange movie and in Multiverse of Madness, but like I don't care about that character, and I don't think he really grew much. And I think a good Doctor Strange probably should, right? We've got arrogant doctor who realizes he's got to, sort of accept a different role and I don't know, become one with the universe kind of. But I never really feel that, right? So to me, Doctor Strange was not helpful in that. I love Wong. I love his cape. Doctor Strange's cape was one of my favorite characters of that movie. But it also is sort of an insult to Doctor Strange. And I'm like, your cape's cool, Wong's cool. I could take you or leave you and probably leave you.
Well, I was going to say it's a real indictment of the MCU Doctor Strange that not only is every other character more interesting than Doctor Strange and Doctor Strange, his wardrobe is more interesting than
I love his cape.
That's absolutely legit. I think that's right. So, all right, was there? I'm gonna guess that Captain America and Black Panther obviously struck you as having leadership qualities. Was there a character that you looked at as you were kind of watching the movies and thinking about them in terms of the book? Was there a character that you went, oh, like you were surprised that they actually had something to contribute that maybe you didn't think about going in, didn't expect?
Yeah, so there's also looking at MCU and really thinking about it. It's really interesting to kind of think about what happens between the scenes and what's really relevant. Black Widow to me is one of those characters where when you look at something like the 5-year gap period, what happened? All of the traditional leaders left, right? Tony Stark goes off. Hulk's going to focus on himself. Captain America, it looks like he's helping people with their grief. Thor again wallowing sort of in self-hatred and all that. And so kind of like all the white dudes that were in charge are like, I'm out. And Hawkeye too. Hawkeye, right? He's going around being Ronin. And so Black Widow she's the lady left standing to try to take care of the world, right?
That's right.
And so when you look 5 years later, people are sad, right, in the world. But the world looks like it's going pretty okay considering the most horrible event of all time has happened, right? This isn't like collapse of the world and, it's the warriors in the street fighting each other. Or if you look at something like Why the Last Man, where, 6 months later, the whole world has collapsed because the dudes are gone, right? This is 5 years later. The world's in pretty good shape. People are sad, but we've got a functioning world. You look at sort of the team that's talking in Black Widow. We've got Black Widow. We've got Okoye from Wakanda. We've got War Machine. We've got Captain America. We've got a team with the most women ever in the MCU coming together in important roles. We have War Machine in an important role, and so we've got this team that's come together partly because a lot of these other leaders have abdicated, right? And so to me, I think Black Widow probably was a really good leader, like a really helpful leader for the world during this 5-year gap, but we don't see it. It just happens off screen. And to me, it's tragic too, because Scott Lang comes back and says, we can fix it. And what happens? All the white dudes that were in charge before say, oh, we can fix it. Let's bring back Cap. Let's bring back Tony. Hulk's fixed. He can be a leader now too, right? And it's actually interesting. There's some research on this idea of what's called the glass cliff. So you've probably heard of the glass ceiling, right? The idea that women and minorities can't get above a certain level. Very big, very real problem. Sure. But there's this other interesting thing with the glass cliff, which is when times are bad, when things are risky, when things are going wrong, women are more likely to be put in charge during those times. Partly it can be that they're like, oh, we got to try something new. Partly it can be you think, oh, women are better with emotions and stuff, and we just had a big scandal. And so what you find is a lot of times women get leadership roles. It's at times when there's the most likelihood to fail. They're at these times when they don't have as much control as a previous leader. And then it's not surprising then when they may not succeed because they've been put in really tough situations. So to my mind, Black Widow is put in a very classic glass cliff situation. I think she did a great job. I wish she had more time we could have seen more of that. And I wish she could have led more after. Instead, she gets to be the sacrifice that no one remembered until Miss Marvel mural or whatever. Right. And that's tragic to me.
Well, it's a good point too, that her movie could have been about that.
Yeah, it could have been.
But instead of just being kind of a random adventure from way before, I'm glad that they did a random adventure from way before. But honestly, they should have done that movie 4 or 5 years earlier when she was still alive in the Marvel universe, and then do the one that we're talking about after Infinity War. So that was just an odd choice by Marvel, and I think they probably look back and regret it now. But oh well. Yeah, we do see her there at the headquarters, kind of like coordinating everything while everybody else, like you say, is kind of checked out. I thought you're right. You don't ever see her get to do a lot, but you definitely get the impression and the sense that she's in charge, that she's not even barely sleeping. She's just sitting there keeping an eye on the world. She's like up in the Justice League satellite looking down, checking out the whole world. That's definitely the impression that I got. So
and the world seems to be in good shape, right? Like people are sad, but it's functioning. There's no, the world isn't exploded or it's not devastated. It's we're doing okay considering we're in this horrible event has affected all of human society. It's interesting. I want to know more, honestly. The 5-year gap period to me is really interesting. And other than, Winter Soldier and Falcon talking about a little bit with some people, I think you could do a lot more on how does that affect the world. It'd be an interesting series to me to look at that.
No, I agree. Yeah. So let's kind of look through then. You have graciously given me kind of an outline of how your chapters go, and I don't want to give away too much because folks need to get the book and kind of learn all about it and stuff. But we can kind of, you already mentioned that your first chapter kind of goes through and lays the foundations, kind of shows how it's all going to work.
Yeah.
All right. So your second chapter is about leader transitions, succession planning, and the sources of leaders' influence through Black Panther. Well, I was going to say, I can definitely see where Civil War leading into Black Panther is certainly about transition.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about what you kind of learned from that.
Yeah. And so, we've got kind of this idea of T'Challa is going to take over. He's the son of the king, and so he's going to take over. But we see very early in Black Panther this idea. We've got this ceremony where anyone can challenge, the new Black Panther, and then they would take over Wakanda. So he's got M'Baku there, so that he fights. And again, he's got a choice early. Do I kill M'Baku because he doesn't support what we're doing, or do I spare him and let him go? And my co-author Sai, he talks about this quite a lot, is he spares him and ultimately kind of makes him a bit of an ally. Again, they don't agree 100%, but if M'Baku was killed, then I think T'Challa would have died when Killmonger beat him, right? There wouldn't have been somebody to save him and kind of do the counterattack to resave Wakanda. And so kind of by him doing that and kind of making an enemy a friend, or at least a frenemy, he set up a situation where he had some support. And so I think when you look at the movie overall, it's great to see sort of T'Challa trying to build relationship with others, while Killmonger has a lot of interesting points. He's a very appealing and charismatic guy, but he don't care about Wakanda at all, right? He doesn't care about the well-being. And so even if you're like, oh, Wakanda should do more in the world, he's not the one to lead it because he only cares about his own vengeance, right? He's got that perspective of war is the most important thing and striking back. Wakanda was not going to do well under him, even if those initiatives did well. So we kind of talk about that in the chapter a bit, in this transitions and the bases of power that leaders have. And a lot of times there's a question of who is the leader or who takes over. And so that's what succession planning is about. How do we set up who's going to take over the leadership, who's ready for it? And T'Challa has been kind of prepared for that. But when there becomes questions of if his dad was appropriate in some of the things he did, that sort of plan gets a little bit thrown off, right? This idea where Killmonger's dad was killed inappropriately. And so sort of the legitimacy of this secession gets called off as well. And that's part of the lead that leads to Killmonger getting, so close to being just in control of Wakanda, and the end of this T'Challa era.
Yeah, that's and I would say I would argue conversely that the Avengers are very poor at leadership transition. It's very haphazard. It's like they don't really have much of a plan, and when there's a disaster, as happens several notable times, it just kind of becomes catch as catch can. Does that you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it's interesting in the comics thinking about transitions as well. The one where the Kooky Quartet starts up is hilarious because Cap's like out of town and comes back, and they're like, everybody's gone. I guess maybe you're in charge, although Hawkeye really wants to be in charge, and Quicksilver really wants to be in charge for some reason. It's madness to think about that's how you're running your organization. I can understand people maybe wanting to leave, but they're just like, Cap might be dead. If he's dead, Hawkeye, I guess, is in charge, and if he comes back, we'll just say, hey, you're in charge now, Cap. See you later. It's fascinating.
we actually just covered that issue yesterday in all the Avengers, and we were talking about how I noted how in number 16, Hawkeye is like, yes, I've been a villain, but now I want to be a hero, and I'll do anything you guys say, and I'm totally on board, and it's all good. And then the very next issue, he's like, you don't think I'm going to listen to you, old man, to Captain America? I need to be in charge of this group. I'm like, what happened to Clint in the space of one issue? He became a complete jerk.
Oh, man. I also like with that issue, Quicksilver sends a letter to be like, dear sir, madame, we should be Avengers. And I guess that's the only letter they get because we don't see anybody else applying. I don't the mechanics are just insane in that issue. I don't know.
They got a bag of mail, but they never show us that anybody else applied, really. And in fact, Vince and Baloo and I were actually talking about the fact that for a minute, you get the idea that maybe the Enchantress and the Executioner might apply because they're kind of hanging around too, And I'm like, oh, that would have been an interesting direction if they had gotten those two instead of Wanda and Pietro.
Yeah, it's interesting because later issues do a lot more of like, the team's changing, people are going to apply, or we got tryouts. Avengers 151 was one of the first issues I ever read of Avengers. And it's got all this like media speculation of who's in, who's out, and the team's all talking about who's going to stay and who should that. And the Avengers have done that several times, and I love those issues where you're like, oh, is Moon Knight going to be on the main team? Is Sandman going to make it? It's always, to me, it's always a really cool thing. So it's weird to see the first one is like as haphazard as humanly possible.
Well, here's my theory about how that played out, and I think you're a good person to run this by, and you tell me what you evaluate my theory. My theory was that Captain America had between issue 4 and issue 15, where 4 is when he gets out of the ice, 15 is when it's the last one before he's the leader, effectively. Over the space of that year and a half, I think it had become very clear to Stan Lee that Captain America needed to be the leader. But he'd also built up this whole thing in all those issues about seniority, and Cap is the newest member, and he doesn't really know everything. And so it was kind of like, as long as Thor and Iron Man and Pym and Janet were there, Cap couldn't really be the leader. But I think Stan wanted Cap to be the leader, so he has to get rid of all the old timers and bring in people that Cap could clearly be the leader over. And then he's got the whole dynamic about people wanting to take over, but now Cap's clearly the leader. So that's kind of what I took from it. I don't know.
Yeah. I think there's some dynamics of like, we want to take out the guys with solo books some more other than Cap. And so there's sort of this commerce part. But it is really that it'd be hard for Cap to take over as the leader well, like Hawkeye ain't going to be the leader. Like the team needs somebody. And for Cap to do that, I think makes a lot of sense. But it is kind of weird because, you know, Cap comes back and he's not used to the era and it's all strange. And so it's weird because we think, you know, from the future, obviously Cap is a great leader. At the time, it's really interesting to think about him as, you know, the least senior member of the team. And,
Right.
you know, and all that. So it's really interesting from the future. Even the whole idea of like Thor, Iron Man, and Cap, which I always thought of, that's the Avengers, right? That's the core. And we've got a lot of eras where those are the three we think about. So it's really interesting to kind of see Cap come aboard and then, you know, these main Avengers to leave for whatever reason. The reason's a little dubious to me in that issue.
Well, one of the other guys yesterday actually made the point that you could even argue that Hawkeye might be older than Captain America in that issue, because if you don't count the years that Cap was in the ice, he was like 22 or something, you know, when he went into the army. Yeah. So he might, you know, Hawkeye could have been 28, 29 and been several years older than Cap. Just think of Cap as being perpetually, you know, 35 or something, but he wasn't that old.
No, he wasn't that. Yeah, I think it was something I wrote with Brian Cronin talking about the Avengers, was just like they act like he's got 40 years of experience when he has like 3 or maybe 5, depending on whatever amount you want to pretend with the war. Because I don't think it's set up really well when in the war he gets frozen. You know, because the comics, he doesn't get frozen in really, you know, because he's still around in the 50s. So it's like you really have a very vague idea.
They went back and retconned that.
I know they retconned, but in reality, he was around. So it's just like, oh yeah, he's in a block of ice since World War II sometime. I feel like Stan didn't want to like be like, it was D-Day, although I feel like maybe they've thrown some of those in at some of the retcons, like meaningful days in history or now when it happened. But
no, that makes sense. We talked a little bit about Guardians of the Galaxy, but I do want to mention, I do want to ask you, I'm not going to ask you about every one of these, and if there's a couple that you definitely want to mention, let's do it. But I do want to ask you about Guardians of the Galaxy just because they're such a great example of I mean, how to describe them in the movies. They're a team basically just because none of them have anywhere else to go and they kind of all just hang together. But I never get the sense that they have this burning passion to have a team and to follow a leader. So how do you lead a team that doesn't even know it's a team and certainly doesn't acknowledge that the leader is the leader? That's a challenge.
Yeah. And I think that's why in the chapter we sort of talk about this idea of shared leadership, of different people at times stepping up, usually based on expertise or desire potentially. And I really think the Guardians movie ends up being like that. We got a problem, we got an issue, we're all together here, and we can't resolve it without working together, right? And so to me, Star-Lord is somewhat the leader, but he's not a directive leader. He's not doing that. I don't know how that team would work in the first movie, at least with, you know, Tony Stark or with Captain America. I feel like somebody giving them orders, they'd be like, screw you, right? And so Peter Quill ends up being kind of a good sort of leader because he's not directive. He's not, you know, it's kind of, he acts individualistic and kind of, they're like, oh, you can work here, we'll listen to you. So there's a lot of listening and letting people kind of lead in that moment. You know, and the movie has that when Drax doesn't really go along and really sees like, oh yeah, having other people help me is crucial for, you know, actually being successful. And so we see, you know, some of that in the movies where they kind of realize together we can accomplish our goal a little bit more. I don't know how that team stays together outside of the movies, really, because there isn't like a good dynamic. But, you know, a team like the Defenders often, you know, feels that way. If it's like either they legitimately hate each other or like, why are they there? You know, what was the original Defenders setup was like they were mystically stuck together and they'd all appear in the same location. You know, they hate each other, but they're all there. And then like other people are like, I just want to join that team. Like Nighthawk and people are like, let's all join and make it a real team. And they're like, we're just together because we're mystically hate each other and have to hang out. So it's interesting, that dynamic a little bit. It changes, of course, as that book goes, but it's an interesting way to start it.
So I don't want to put too much of a spoiler. Have you seen the new Thor movie?
No, I haven't yet. I
Right.
haven't seen it
This
yet.
is this is the type of thing you get in the trailer. So, and it's already shown
Sure.
part of it.
Yeah,
So,
I've seen
so
the
I
trailer.
don't think I'm going to ruin anybody's life if I just say this one line. But there's a bit, and you see this in the trailer, where Thor and Star-Lord are kind of having their little, like Thor is always like, "Yes, I'm the big shot here," and Star-Lord's, "Well, no, not really, I am," and Thor's like, "Haha,
Yeah.
of course I am." They have that funny, that
Yeah,
repartee.
they got a good
Well,
dynamic.
it wasn't in the trailer, but in the movie, it continues a little bit further. And Thor is like, "Well, I'll be leaving now. So, Peter Quill, you may now lead my team." And he's like, "But it's my team." Thor's like, "Yes, no, don't object. You can lead my team now." And Star-Lord's like, "It's not your team." So
That's
I
funny.
thought you'd appreciate that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
That
yeah. No,
there's a real,
absolutely.
when somebody kind of thinks they're the leader,
Yeah, yeah.
what do you do then? What is it?
Yeah, yeah. I think Peter does the worst with that group when he thinks he's the leader. When he's just trying
Yes.
to influence others, I think it goes okay. But when he tries to pull rank, he just gets laughed at.
That's right. Yeah. And they make it even funnier in these various movies by having everybody else in the team loving Thor
Oh
clearly
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
openly, which just makes Peter burn up because there's the
Huh.
jealousy that I want to be the leader,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah,
they're looking at somebody else.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's so good. Let me see. I want to ask you about, we talked about Civil War, so I'm gonna say, all right, now
Okay,
you have a chapter about stress and crisis and how that impacts all of this. Certainly Infinity War and Endgame certainly put the whole world through stress. So
oh
so
yeah.
talk a little bit about how we see, reactions to something that bad happening and how leadership can work there.
Yeah, yeah. And so, in talking about when we talked about the chapter some, we talk about stress in a few ways, and we talk about the Hulk actually a lot as well.
Okay.
Because Hulk, of course, is all about that stress, that anger, and trying to sort of get it in line. And so, when we look at stuff like stress, we look at PTSD, we've kind of got these things, and stress can be good at times. But when we have stress for too long and too severe, it really wears us out. It hurts us physically and emotionally and mentally. And we have to find out ways to try to fix the issue or resolve it. And so we talk about that in the chapter, looking at different ways to do that. And the different ways essentially are how quickly you can do it, how short term it is, and how much it makes a real change. And so one of the easiest, lowest level things is what we call sort of reactive strategies. So, if we see in the movies Bruce Banner is about to turn into the Hulk and he tries to kind of calm down or tries to, in the comics, he's trying to like, I'm going to put myself in a cave and close the door type stuff.
Right.
And so we've got these strategies of like, things are bad. I've got to try to just come up with something in the moment. And I always think about it with things like deadlines or studying, where if you got the test tomorrow or, the book draft is due tomorrow, you get out your coffee, you turn on your loud music, you just push through to try to get the thing done by when you need it, right? And so that's a strategy that can work in the short term for that one event. But then what happens the next day? You're tired, you can't do anything. Maybe you're tired for a week. I know as I've gotten older, you don't bounce back. You're like,
That's true.
okay, as a kid, I would have been fine the next day, but now I'm like, I'm out for a week.
Yep.
Since I didn't get enough sleep, right? And so those types of strategies can be really good in the short term, but they don't help the situation, especially if the stress continues. And I think with superheroes, that's what we see, right? You beat this villain, and then next week we got a new villain that's as bad or often worse. And so you never get that break. You never reduce that stress. And that's kind of the next level that we get is sort of these strategies of how can I get better at taking stress? So things like yoga or time management, those things can help you do better. And you actually see the Hulk does this as well, right? And we actually talk about the first Hulk movie, which, we don't talk about in the MCU stuff nearly as much because it's kind of an oddball with what it is. But he's got this like wristwatch that tells his, I think it's his blood pressure, right? And so what happens is he's like, oh, my blood pressure is going up. I better, calm down, right? And we see this sometimes in other Hulk things. And so again, that's kind of a strategy he's developed. He's got this tool that helps him to reduce the stress. That's pretty good, but it doesn't actually reduce your stress level overall, right? You're just a little bit better at it. And that's kind of the last category that we talk about, is that even active strategies. We're going to come up with a strategy where our actual stress is reduced. And so with superheroes, it might be a decision to stop being a superhero. It might be a decision to get extra help. So instead of just fighting on your own, you're going to get a team together. Or, Iron Man will work on Mondays and War Machine will work on Tuesdays. We don't see that in the movies, but in some of the comics with things like the Initiative or these super groups, it can be, this day you're fighting, this day you're on monitor duty, so you can kind of recover. And I think the Hulk and his progression in Endgame fits that really well, right? He takes some time, he goes out there, he integrates his two selves and comes together in a better version of himself. And so therefore he's kind of dealt with his stress in a way. That big stress of being the Hulk has been reduced, but it took a lot of work, mostly off camera, right? Similar to the Black Widow situation. But it's something that took a lot of time, but he did change his life so that he has less stress. He has less of this Hulk that's a big problem. Because when he thinks of the Hulk just as a problem to solve as opposed to part of himself, he can't get better. And that's kind of an interesting kind of area with that. And so we talk about some of those stress management strategies in that chapter a little bit. And so yeah, it's kind of a fun look at these different things. And we deal with this stuff in our own life, like how often do students pull an all-nighter, or you just try to work really hard and just you're really tired or really worn out. We do that a lot. And those are the worst way to deal with it, because we haven't solved our stress level issues. We've just solved the crisis today.
Right. Yeah. That's an excellent point for sure. All right. I want to get in a few more. I'm really interested about this one. I thought that was really good, though. I hadn't thought about the Hulk in terms of that, but yeah, I'm dealing with stress. So Tony Stark. So we really do. I mean, as much as any character in the MCU, he gets I think just because he gets so much screen time. Yeah. Right? I mean, he's probably in more movies up through Endgame. And honestly, if you count, he's basically in both of the first two Spider-Man movies, even though he's not in the second one. He might as well be. Yeah. He kind of dominates it. And the first Spider-Man movie is basically Marvel team up Spider-Man and Iron Man, which is the reason I like it. Yeah. But so he's in so many movies. We get to see him evolve from what he is at the beginning of the first Iron Man movie all the way through to what he does at the end of Endgame. How does Tony Stark evolve as a leader, and what are some things you think that really make those changes happen?
Yeah. And so the chapter, we talk a lot about his own self-awareness and his authenticity, his authentic leadership. And so this idea of being authentic as a leader is kind of being in touch with who you are, being honest, being open, and kind of understanding what you want to do, what your strengths and weaknesses are, those types of things. Because as I think I alluded to earlier, we spend a lot of time acting like people listen to leaders and our CEOs or our bosses are perfect. And, we just follow them and they do it. But I think a lot of times those images just aren't very accurate of life. And we all have our strengths and we all have our weaknesses. We all have our preferences. And I think to some degree, the Iron Man movies and then Avengers and other movies is kind of this path of Tony Stark figuring out who is the authentic Tony Stark. What does he really care about? What's important to him?
Yes.
And what I love about that with him is it doesn't mean his authentic self is a saint. He's still kind of a jerk, even when he's being his best self. And to me, that's a very powerful thing, that your best self can be still kind of a jerk. We might think of that as a negative thing, but to me, it's great because Tony Stark figures out what matters to him and the type of leader he is. So we talk about this in the chapter at the start of Iron Man 1, right? He brags about dating supermodels, and he's on the cover of, I don't know what magazine they decided to put him on the cover of, but so he's famous, he's rich, You know, everybody loves him, right? Yeah, people want to take selfies with him. But what you find out pretty quickly, even before he gets kind of kidnapped, you kind of get this dead-eyed, like, I'm kind of miserable in the life I have.
Yes.
And so he's really does not feel fulfilled in his life. Even though you'd think he has everything he needs, he's got this great life. He's not doing something that he really cares about. And so being kidnapped and having this traumatic life event makes him realize, I don't want to be a warmonger. I don't want to be a weapons maker, which isn't something that happens in the comics anywhere quickly.
Yeah.
He's a warmonger selling missiles for a long time in the comics.
Long time.
Long time. Yeah. But he says, this is not what I want to do. I want to have a positive impact on the world. And so the Iron Man thing comes kind of about, but he struggles with what that means. To be a superhero with a secret identity, is that what he wants? Well, as we have that famous end of scene in Iron Man, he doesn't want a secret identity. I'm Tony Stark. I'm Iron Man, right? And so other superheroes might be hiding their identity or doing all these things. Tony's got to be himself, and he can't be Iron Man in secret, as we see all the time in comics. It seems like every love interest is in love with either the hero they are or like hates that hero and would never spend time with them. I'm reading that in Spider-Man right now in the early issues. You know, it's all about the love interest either hates Spider-Man or hates Peter Parker one direction. And all the DC heroes have that same thing. I feel they all love the superhero and hate or don't care about the secret identity, right? And so Tony's authentic self is out there and doing it, not hiding behind it. But he still's not there yet, because he spends a lot of time Iron Man 2, Iron Man 3 being about, oh, I should stop being Iron Man, right? To really have a positive impact on the world, I shouldn't be a flashy superhero. I should be doing good work. And so that's something that somebody could do. It's a very reasonable choice to make. But again, that's not Tony. Tony needs to be out there fighting that. He needs to be making the sacrifice. And we see that in Avengers. We see that in Endgame ultimately as well, is that he needs to be out there on the front line. He wants to be involved. He can't hide behind it. He can't just send out, a drone force of Iron Man armor. He feels like he has to be out there with the people. He has to be himself. And so we see him going back and forth, and, something like the end of Iron Man 3, where he's blowing up all his armor and then I guess rebuilding it about 5 minutes later for the next movie. It's not a real arc for Iron Man and Tony as he is in that. He needs to be that one out there putting his life at risk. He's not just going to send his people to take care of it. And so to me, it's kind of that arc of authenticity for him is, yeah, I'm going to be brash. Yeah, I'm going to be kind of a jerk. I'm going to be kind of a brat. And I want people to look at what I'm doing positively. But I'm somebody that really cares. I'm going to give you my opinion. I'm going to put in as much work as anybody else and maybe a lot more. That's just who he is as a person. And by doing that, I think he becomes a better leader. He becomes a better hero. Even when things like, Civil War, where he tries to abdicate responsibility, right? I don't want to do that. I want others to decide. Again, I think that's him not being authentic with himself and what he wants. And I think that's part of the reason it ends up going very badly, is because he doesn't think about he needs to be there. He needs to make that sacrifice, even though at the cost to his own daughter and his wife. Ultimately, he can't just send the Avengers out, help them, and say, I'm the guy who makes armor for you. He needs to be there. And that's just who he is. And so it's a really interesting arc to me to watch. And he goes back and forth because he's not sure and he doesn't know himself. He's not as aware as he needs to be at times, which is how life is, right? We don't have a progression from 0 to 100%. we make progress, we fall back, one step forward, one step back. Sometimes not forward progress,
That's an interesting point too. I've always said that Tony Stark in the movies is what Bruce Wayne pretends to be, but with Tony, he's not pretending, which is like the drunken playboy, right? But what's interesting to me about Tony Stark and Iron Man in the movies is that even being that, let me put it this way, we understand that Bruce Wayne will pretend to be that but of course he's really more Batman than Bruce Wayne, and he's going to get the job done, right? That's just a smokescreen.
Yeah,
but with Tony Stark, he really is that. It's not a pretense, and yet he still, even with that situation, still manages to get the job done and be a leader and win the game, win the fight. And I think that's even more impressive. You know what I mean? He's coming from a deeper hole in some ways than Bruce Wayne is.
It's part of his drive. That stuff feeds him and keeps him going. Well, with Batman, it's just part of this pretense.
Right.
So yeah, it's interesting. To me, that difference.
Another Tony Stark thing. I think we all know that the Tony Stark in the comics for 40 years or whatever before the movie was a very different character than the character that Robert Downey kind of co-created in the movies. Still, I like the fact that like once every 3 or 4 years in the comics, there was over and over and over there was a storyline of somebody out there is coming to take Tony's company away from him.
Oh, yeah.
And if there was one thing that was guaranteed to motivate Tony Stark to fight, it was so he could remain the leader of Stark International, Stark Enterprises, whatever it is. You could blow up his house. You could do whatever. He's like, okay, you try to take his company away and it's on, right? So, I mean, whether it was Midas, Stain, Hammer, Shield at one point. You talked about how Tony finally did stop making munitions. When Tony finally in the comics stopped making munitions, Nick Fury and Shield came and tried to take the company over because they wanted their weapons that he was making. So it's like every 6 months, it seems like somebody was coming and trying to take Stark's company away, and he relished being the leader of that industry, didn't he?
Yeah. I think a captain of industry is a big part of him in the comics, to a way that you don't really see. It could have been something in MCU, but it really is not nearly as much. Yeah, he's throwing away his business to try to do good in the movies a lot more than he does in the comics. That company really does matter to him a lot in the comics, which is interesting.
That is. Yeah. Let me see. Are there? We got 3 or 4 more, and we got about 8-10 minutes left. And I do want to ask you about your book and everything, about how to get it, how people can get it, and everything.
Sure.
Are there other specific chapters you think that you really want to kind of cover? Let's get in 1 or 2 more, but I want to let you pick.
Oh, sure. I can do a twofer as well a little bit. So we go a little beyond the MCU, and we talk about some of the X-Men movies, for instance. One of the things that I think is really interesting with the X-Men is thinking about this idea of how a leader defines reality for people. And so we talk about this. We got a chapter, I think it's called like, am I an X-Men? Am I a mutant? Am I a menace? Kind of a fun. I came up with all these funny titles forever. Some of the other books have things like the title is celebrations for a chapter, but mine's always like a weird joke. I was like trying to make them as snappy as possible for this, which I think fits with comics, honestly. But I love coming up with them. But it's all about how people like Professor Xavier, people like Magneto, even people like Senator Kelly, or whoever's creating the cure for mutant, being a mutant. It's Worthington in Last Stand. It's somebody else in the comics, right? Is trying to define what it means to be a mutant and trying to make mutants think about themselves as what they should be thinking about, how they should see themselves, and that type of thing. And leaders do that all the time in organizations because they try to define what you should care about, where you should focus your attention, what's relevant to you. And so we see that with Professor X talking about, we should be helping society. We're part of humanity. We're a crucial part of it. While we've got Magneto being like, we're homo superior. We should be ruling them, or they're inherently a threat. And so all of this is them trying to influence as a leader what you should be doing as a mutant, and what organization you should join. And that's what we do in another chapter talking about selection processes and leader selection, is that leaders try to find members for their team, and they've got to try to appeal to those members of what matters to them. And so we look at something like in X-Men 2, the character of Pyro, who, if you'd read the comics, you'd known he was going to go with Magneto in the end, of course.
Right.
But in the movie, there's this idea of he doesn't really care that much about what Xavier is. He's cynical about it. And Magneto has a much more appealing vision. You can be superior. You can have an impact as opposed to just being another kid at that school. And unfortunately, I don't think the X-Men movies start to sputter out, and Last Stand, has a lot of issues, ultimately, plot-wise. But it's interesting to think about Pyro making this call to be like, helping humanity, being a hero isn't what I want. I'd rather be in this one, because Magneto talks a lot about embrace your powers, right? You should use them to the fullest. You shouldn't clamp them down. If you use your fire and it burns up a bunch of people, that's okay, because you're homo superior, right? And so that's a different way to appeal to people. And there's different people that should be X-Men, that should be in the Brother of the Mutants, or even people that might want to try to get cured when there's a cure in the comics. And so there's all this definition of what matters to you, and leaders play a big part in it. So it's kind of fun to talk about that in a book and kind of think about how those different leaders come about it in a different way. Now, the comics muddy that a lot with, Xavier's good, he's bad, Magneto as well.
For sure.
There's a lot of that, and it's a little clearer in most of the movies.
I just talked to Chris Claremont at DragonCon last year on a panel about this, and he said that his goal from the very beginning was to get rid of Professor X and have Magneto become the leader of the X-Men. That was always from day one what he wanted to do, and so there you go.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Claremont, of course, being one of the greats of all time, and that X-Men run, and somebody who really was interested in doing new things with them and made them what they are, because the early X-Men issues, not a fan of that era at all. Mm-hmm. It's really like Professor X giving people demerits and everybody wearing the same clothing and looking the same. Like it needs some work to my mind.
Amazing it survived as long as it did to get to where it could be removed. All right, so let's see. One last chapter you want to talk about that you think would be people would find fascinating.
Let's see, what else is in there. We've got another Black Panther one, I think, talking about external relations and Stan, just pick one. What do you think?
Well, let's talk about, you wrap it up. So at the end, you kind of bring it all together and you kind of say, this is our takeaway, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what we do kind of in the last chapter, is we kind of take some of these lessons. We help to distill them a little bit for how you might use this. Okay. And so we kind of think about this idea of being a superhero leader, of using these to become the best leader you can be, and learning, we all make mistakes and we can all improve. And I think that's what I love about Marvel Comics. And that, of course, is one of the things that helped them to be, sort of compete with DC, was this idea of, we got flawed heroes that fight with each other, but still save the day. Sometimes in the old comics, it's crazy. Like the Avengers, as you've been reading, they're sometimes fighting for no apparent reason. Oh, and sure. Kooky Quartet is all about crazy fighting with each other stuff. We're like, why are you doing this, guys? It don't make any sense. But it's more like real life, where we just have different perspectives and different views, and we need to talk about it. We shouldn't fight about it necessarily, or actual fisticuffs as we often have in those teams. But we need to talk it through and figure it out, and we don't have to agree. But if we got goals, we need to work together to get to them. So that's kind of what we talk about in this last chapter. Really try to apply it and think about, how could I apply that? How could I use it?
Good deal. All right, so I'm going to ask you just in general about the book to wrap us up. But I have one last question I've got to know. In all your viewing of the MCU and all your thinking about this, what was the greatest example of leadership? And I know you've talked about a lot of different kinds, so that may be an unfair question to you, but just in general, what comes to your mind when I say greatest example of showing leadership in the MCU so far?
So to me, I think T'Challa in Black Panther, his ability to work with others, to really care about their perspective. And at that ending, when he says to Killmonger, you don't have to die, we can still work together. After all that's happened, after all the crazy stuff, he still tries to make an enemy into a friend, is something that I think is really powerful as a leader. Because, you know, we can be like, you insulted me once, you're dead to me. And we can feel that energy. But to still be trying, to me, is very helpful. I'm sure Cy would probably talk about Captain America and his focus on the little guy as well, and really living what you're preaching and really wanting to help as well. So those are kind of the big two that I kind of see as really good and strong leadership.
I would have guessed those two, and that's good to know. It seems that way. The king and the general, basically the captain. All right, so tell folks. So is your book out, or is it coming out, or what's the status?
Yeah. So it came out in early June. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Walmart apparently sells books online. You can feel free to buy it there if you love Walmart, I guess. But it's on eBay too. Apparently, people selling it all over. So if you're on the internet, you should be able to find it. And you know, if you want to reach out or anything, or ask questions about the book or do stuff, both Cy and I are online. I'm on at IO Psychology through Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. You know, feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to talk to you more about the book. We love talking about it. We love talking about superheroes in general, because we're big fans of all this stuff. So,
all right, that's Dr. Gordon Schmidt, just so everybody knows, those listening and not seeing the video. And the book is Leaders Assemble: Leadership in the MCU. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I really appreciate you coming on. This was really cool.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun. Thanks so much for having me.
All right.